So, most welcome to 1196. I hope I am audible. We're having a slight problem with the microphone here. Looking for a complete new microphone because this one is not doing its purpose. Well, truth is it cannot be connected to this device. I'll continue with time temporality from Whitehead to quantum physics. Nice article by Dr. Joachim Klose of Dresden, Germany. And I began already at 1195, and I will now continue at 1196. And I just finished off by comparing Engels and Whitehead with each other. There are some similarities. They both want to look into the postmodern world after Newton. But the difference between Whiteheadian perspectives and the ones by Engels is that he's not interested in representing a dialectical materialism. Alfred North Whitehead arrives at completely different conclusions. He asks himself whether we can define an organism without recurrence to the concept of matter in simple location, and he radically rejects every type of materialism. In terms of experience, language and logic, the teaching of a substance forming the basis of all things seems to be the most natural way to look at last things. In modernity, however, the original logical substance quality pattern has been raised to the basic structure of reality. The result is that relations between things can no longer be taken into account. Neither individual experiences nor the natural sciences give reason to believe in invariable subjects. On the contrary, the whole being of reality is in a process of becoming and passing. Hope you can connect that to absencing and presencing in the Heideggerian perspective. Whitehead suggests seeing reality as analogous to an organism. His speculative cosmology in process and reality is the logical construction of a philosophy of organism based on the results of the theory of evolution. However, he tries to integrate all experiences of reality. For this reason, he criticizes Darwinism, which completely excludes creativity. Well, it does, doesn't it? Bifurcation. 2. The sciences are not concerned with epistemological matters, but rather with a coherent explanation of nature. This fact leads to the bifurcation of reality. Whitehead categorically rejects the distinction between events of nature and events as they are formulated in scientific theories, and the distinction between events of nature as they exist by themselves and as they appear to us. The first concept maintains a purely conceptual existence of physical entities, such as atoms and electrons. For Whitehead, scientific concepts are derived from nature by way of logical abstraction. He argues against the bifurcation of reality into the mathematical world and the apparent world. Concepts, as far as they are true, refer directly to facts of reality. The second formulation of bifurcation is a consequence of the first. Historically, after separating the realm of apparent nature from that of its physical description, John Locke asked how both realms could be connected. Isaac Newton developed a kinetic theory of atoms, but he did not explain how unperceivable atoms in absolute space and time are connected with our space-time experience. In addition to the first bifurcation between scientific object and sensory perception, a second bifurcation appears between sensory perception and reality itself. This results in the banishing of the observer from nature. The observer can have knowledge only of his sensory impressions, not of the objects which produce them. The knowledge of reality now requires a theory. If the material substances are only in space, then a material substance can act only upon material substances, not upon a mental substance. How aptly put. Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz concluded, either the material substances must be brought within the space in the field of awareness of the mental substances, or the mental substance must be defined in terms of the material substances. The latter is impossible for him, because he would then be confronted with Locke's problem. This is why he developed his monads. Perception. To avoid these bifurcations, the origin of every possible knowledge must be considered. Whitehead regards this origin within everyone's daily experiences and addresses directly the British empiricist starting point. 1. Every experience has its origin in perceptions. 2. The primary ideas of perception join secondary ideas deduced by reflection in order to put the sense data into order. 3. In addition to these two starting points, Whitehead integrates psychic impressions such as emotions, beauty, love, and satisfaction. If Whitehead would restrict himself to the British empiricist theory of perception, he would be subjected to the false conclusion that reality is constituted out of static and isolated substances. Because he does not, he can do justice to relations in sensory perceptions due to the broadening of theory of perception through the mode of causal efficacy. Perceptions are normally described in presentational immediacy. This mode of perception presents the spatial relationships between the perceiver and sense data, even while temporal aspects are ignored. Perceptions in presentational immediacy are preferred compared to causal efficacy because they are directed by attention. Attention is comprised of a teleological and a temporal aspect. The analysis of past data directs the attention to the emergence of future data. Them bells. Perceptions are normally described in presentational immediacy. This mode of perception presents the spatial relationships between the perceiver and sense data, even while temporal aspects are ignored. Perceptions in presentational immediacy are preferred compared to causal efficacy because they are directed by attention. Attention is compromised by a teleological and a temporal aspect. The analysis of past data directs the attention to the emergence of future data. However, the analysis of past data, is no longer part of a presentational immediacy, but rather of causal efficacy. Attention is the cut between presentational immediacy and causal efficacy. All scientific observations are made in the perceptive mode of presentational immediacy. However, physical theories refer exclusively to causal efficacy. If all knowledge is traced back to perception at one time, one cannot have empirical knowledge of relations, nor of the continuum of reality. Contrary to David Hume and Immanuel Kant, Whitehead finds evidence for causal connections and temporal continuity in sensory perception. He asserts that one can perceive them directly in the mood of causal efficacy, tacitly assuming the experience of temporal and spatial extensions. Temporally adjacent events are perceived directly in a temporal window of perception. The spacious present. It is perceivable that later events confirm earlier ones. We have knowledge of an extensive continuum of reality because of our perception of space-time relations. The spacious present contains not only immediately observed events, it also includes the immediate past. The presence of immediate past events shows that present and future events have to confirm earlier events in the same way that immediate past events had to confirm events in the even more distant past. Causality in Whitehead's philosophy means that we never perceive a series of events alone. Later events must emerge from earlier events in that specious present. Perceptions in the causal efficacy contain the temporal aspects of the process of reality. In causal efficacy, we become aware of the dependence of our experience upon bodily functioning. Sensory perception takes place only in the complex mode of symbolic reference connecting two pure modes. As a result, perception in symbolic reference causes errors and misinterpretations. Symbolic reference is an active synthetic element of the perceiver, producing emotions, convictions, beliefs concerning other elements of reality. 4. Time. Within each period of his philosophical development, Whitehead expresses that space and time do not exist independently. It is an abstraction whose explanation requires reference to that from which it has been abstracted. In Whitehead's natural philosophy, the real world is an extended, continuously flowing process. Later in his metaphysical period, space and time were seen as abstractions from extended events and are to be experienced empirically. Time. Within each period of his philosophical development, Whitehead expresses that space and time do not exist independently. It is an abstraction whose explanation requires reference to that from which it has been abstracted. In Whitehead's natural philosophy, the real world is an extended, continuously flowing process. Later in his metaphysical period, space and time were seen as abstractions from extended events and are to be experienced empirically. Time does not have any reality in nature, but is a property of a perceiver. The reality is characterized by an extensive space-time continuum. Events in nature do not have any reality independent of a consciousness and do not have definite temporal extensions. Time relations are an expression of an ordering relation of a perceiver. Physical time only deals with certain formal relational aspects of our changing human experience. Relative to other abstractions, space and time offer a comparatively simple structure, which is suitable as a basis for objective distinctions in reality. During the specious present, that is the extended time limit where we experience, which is not a point-like moment, it has always extension, and that extension is important. Otherwise, no understanding of reality can come. During the specious present, one perceives a unit already separated into its parts by the activity of the perceiver, but it's not clear how one can proceed from individual experiences to a uniform space-time structure. Whitehead confesses that what he has termed the uniformity of the texture of experience is a mere illusion. This uniformity does not belong to the immediate relations of crude data of experience, but rather is a result of substituting more refined logical entities. We are not directly aware of a smoothly running world. The epochal theory of time. The transition from momentary events to extended actual occasions is not only initiated by the knowledge that perception takes place in the specious present and that causal interactions are directly perceivable. It is also a result of logical difficulties within physical theories and metaphysical outlines. Physical descriptions of dynamic processes like impulse, velocity, tension, and the descriptions of simple physical structures like atoms or biological organisms presupposes the existence of temporal events. In addition, becoming is only possible if reality is constituted out of temporal atomic events. Becoming and continuity are incompatible. Here, Whitehead shows that momentary events can be deduced out of extensional events by means of the method of extensive abstraction, one of his central ideas. All these points forced him to conclude that reality is not founded on momentary events, but rather on temporal, extended events. In the post-1924 development of quantum theory, first results motivated him to transfer the new knowledge of philosophy and psychology to all events of reality. The particles of reality were no longer material, static forms, but rather spatiotemporal extended events. Whitehead got his inspiration from scientific discoveries without necessarily going into the specific formalism. His doctrine of the epochal character of time depends on the analysis of the intrinsic character of an event, considering to be the most concrete, finite entity which he calls the actual occasion. In the epochal theory of time, Whitehead unifies 4 different time aspects to be found in the experience of an actual occasion. There are 2 internal and 2 external aspects. The internal time aspects are the passage of thought and the experience of extension. The external time aspects are the potential physical time and the actual physical time. The experience of extension corresponds to potential physical time. The passage of mind corresponds to the passage of nature. The physical concept of time unifies the experience of an extensive continuum and the perception of concrete, actual occasions. It unifies the discontinuity and continuity of the external world into one singular concept, something that is impossible in the logocentric world. 5. Actual entities. While in Whitehead's natural philosophy, events still depend on the activity of a perceiver, actual occasions in his metaphysics are the final units of reality. They are the real things of the world, and they have their own being. They are not momentary cuts through reality, but rather forms which have the properties of spatio-temporal extension and creativity. An actual entity is limited in terms of space and time, and in comparison to other actual entities, owns a defined space-time position. It follows that an actual entity neither moves nor changes. Entities appear and disappear like the ideas in the stream of ideas in our mind. Every actual occasion is a spatio-temporal unit possessing an indivisible volume and time quantum, which cannot be dissembled without being destroyed. actual occasions express the uniform space-time structure of the universe because their external relations fit them into subordinate actual occasions, and their internal relations, the coordinate divisibility, divide them into subordinate actual occasions. Actual entities whose unity can be dissolved into subordinate actual entities are called nexus. The usual things like trees, houses and cars are all nexus. Nexus take into account the unity of contemporary events which are not causally tied together. If a nexus owns an ordinal degree, Whitehead calls it society. Prehension. The content of an actual entity is constituted only by perceptions, like the contents of Locke's idea. The perceiving actual entity is connected with other entities by perceptions. Whitehead's philosophy of organism is generalization and extension of his theory of perception. However, perception is not limited to sensory perception, but refers to every kind of causal influences. Prehension is a short form of apprehension. Apprehension indicates recognition and does not mean that the perceived had to be present, but presupposes consciousness. Consciousness belongs only to a few highly developed organisms. Whitehead's concept of perception should also contain unaware recognition. Therefore, the concept of prehension was introduced. Every entity which is prehended as a unity is an actual unity. God is an actual entity, so is the most trivial puff of existence in far-off empty space. Actual entities are not only microcosmic. For Whitehead, the whole universe, or just a single atom, is an actual entity. An actual entity is linked with every other actual entity of the universe by means of prehension. Although all actual entities of the world are prehended, nor every actual entity contributes to the new actual entity. Otherwise, all actual entities would be the same and therefore indistinguishable. The becoming actual entity selects all positive prehensions for its constructions. They are called sensations or feelings. An actual entity feels the contributions of other actual entities and integrates them into its construction. There is a significant difference between perception which is causally influenced by perceived objects, and prehension, which means a coming together of different parts of reality. The latter could also mean a going together of very distant events. Thus, there is also a strand in Whitehead's metaphysics discussing parapsychological phenomena, especially telepathy. For Whitehead, physical science maintains its denial of action at a distance. The safer guess is that direct objectification is practically negligible except for a contiguous occasion. In this respect, I believe that Henry Stapp did not sufficiently take into account Whitehead's discussion of prehensions when he claimed that Whitehead's system of metaphysics is incompatible with quantum theory due to Bell's theorem. In contrast, Bell's theorem could be used to support process philosophy. Each event does prehend all creation, not only those events found in its backward light cone, as Henry Stapp predicated. The unity of the world would be destroyed if each event would prehend only its own actual world. How true, that is something to figure out. There's something to think about. It is a very important fact, and neglecting understanding that will, without a doubt, lead us to material reductionism. There is no choice at all. This is why the Whiteheadian concept of efficacy is so important. There is no other way of not ending into determinism or reductionism. It's unavoidable. Anyone who says something else, and I challenge you, write some comments if you think it's possible to avoid reductionism. Without this, I say there is none. It's absolutely impossible. You need to jump some conclusion or be completely dishonest and just say something and trying to convince yourself. But that will never ever work, because we cannot trick reality. What is established is established. This is a dual way of looking at establishment, where both sides need to be present. Listen to this. A theory of perception connects causally past events with present ones, but the theory of prehension changes the perspective. It describes the development of reality from present to future, and therefore a growing actual entity is not the perceiving subject in the process of prehension. The perceiving subject does not exist before the perceived events and is not their contemporary. This would mean a new formulation of concept of substance, of a basis of bearing the phenomena. Vice versa, the perceived events are temporal before the objectifying actual entity. Prehensions reach into the future like tentacles. They grow together into a new unity. However, this process does not take place locally and aimlessly. It is accompanied by an ideal, the subjective aim. Actual entities lead their incremental process. They present themselves as the aim of this process. In this respect, they are both subject and superject in one event. The superject being the decisive element in the process. Whitehead generalizes the structure of perception of a consciousness. He ascribes this structure to nature as a basic structure of reality. Nature does not appear anymore as coexisting, separate particles of matter, but rather as a network of organically interconnected entities. Creativity 7. Every future entity means a coming together of all available elements of reality. The fact that every entity of reality tends to unification and to higher complexity is an empirical fact. The internal motivating force of the reality process are creative process of becoming. These Whitehead calls concrescence. One constitutive quality possessed by all entities is creativity and its impetus of progress to new units of reality. The theory of evolution did not answer why evolution as a whole has led towards ever more complicated life forms, compared with the general laws of physics, which postulate that there will be an equal distribution of energy and decay throughout the universe. Processes leading to higher organization forms exists. We know from our observation of human and animal experiences that purposes are immediate components of the constitution of living beings. Physiology and physics, which describe reality only in terms of active causes, ignore these experiences. Therefore, their theories are not adequate descriptions of reality as a whole. An adequate description of the universe has to contain aspects of efficient and final causation. For this reason, we may not describe nature only in terms that ignore one side of reality. The only kind of entities observable in nature are living organisms, which unify final and efficient causation. Very important. It is more reasonable to transfer the concept frame of living organism to all phenomena of reality than the reverse. Whitehead's philosophy of organism attributes the double character of efficient and final causation to the final things of the universe. He identifies the energetic activity of physical entities with the emotional intensity which can be perceived in the life of biological nature. All entities of reality are living beings. Neither the nature of physical entities nor life can be understood independently of each other. Life implies 1. Self-preservation, 2. Creative activity, 3. Teleological aim. The contrast efficient causation, final causation, decay, pursuit of higher complexity, and body-mind are unified in the life concept. All events of reality live if they compromise these tensions. According to the theory of evolution, primordial physical events enter into mental events and causes them. According to the philosophy of organism, the reverse is basic. It takes back the grounds of mental events by using physical ones. Well, listen to that. Every event possesses A, mental, and B, physical experiences. Mental experiences are experiences of defined forms, universals, eternal objects, regardless of their concrete determination of being. Physical experiences are conservations of facts given to the event by its constitution of being. An actual occasion is the product of the interplay of the physical with the mental pole. The physical pole is extended over the whole space-time continuum and can be divided. In contrast, the mental pole does not share in the divisibility of the physical pole. The mental pole has its equivalent in a thought of mind. It is an act of attention with the duration of the specious present. Passage of mind is confronted with the experience of an unlimited temporal act in the internal time concept. Eight, teleology. Present actual entities do not anticipate their future determination, but rather their subjective aim. If an actual entity always and unavoidably reaches its subjective aim, all future events would be determined by present ones and vice versa. This is not the case. The subjective aim is a future aim of a present development envisaged by the becoming actual entity. As an eternal object, it is the vision of a future state which influences the way it develops into this state. The vision influences the actual entity in its decision, but is not the final determination. The difference between the present state of development process and the subjective aim is the excitement pushing an actual entity forward to higher states of development. Its appetite for completion will have evaporated if a state of satisfaction is reached. An actual entity reaches fulfillment if the difference between the subjective aim and satisfaction has become negligible. The process is finished at a certain state of convergence. One has to understand this approximation process as a process of fulfilling an ideal. It could be concluded from the pursuit of the subjective aim that there has to be something within which the subjective aim is present. Something exists that moves towards this aim. This thought puts a subject under the reality process envisioning the subjective aim and is the medium of the process of development. This means that there has to be a substrate of changes in reality which contradicts Whitehead's intention. Where does one find an origin of the subjective aim in the concrescence process of an actual entity? Whitehead denies the intentions of past actual entities. They have passed away and do not possess a transition to future aims. A growing actual entity perceives the subjective aim as a date of an actual word. It is contemporaneous with past actual entities. As a purpose, it is neither a cause nor an effect. The moving finis in the final nexus is the interpretation of a purpose as a cause. The subjective aim determines which prehension delivers a positive contribution to the growing actual entity. According to Whitehead, the subjective aim is made available by God. This is the crucial point. From where does mentality get a future picture? Are there experiences or concepts which are not reducible to the observed nature? One can only distinguish between subjective aim and satisfaction if the concrescence process is limited in time. Whitehead took for granted that teleology assumes temporal atomicity, and that temporal atomicity is only possible in a state of reality which is teleological. In a cosmology with a continuous concept of time, real becoming is impossible. There are only changes which are transformation from one state into another. However, a physical process which is teleologically constituted assumes an aim of development for the single entities. 9. Transmission and concrescence. Reality is the common presentation of two kinds of processes, concrescence and transmission. The internal process is the process of concrescence. It makes up the essence of actual entities and is teleologically structured. The external process characterizes the progress from actual entity to actual entity, from the past to the future. It is characterized by causality and conformity and described by the theory of evolution. Transmission is a process of concrescence processes, and concrescence is a process of transmission processes. Reality is a process of processes. Every actual process contains a huge number of interlocking actual processes. The whole universe is a single process as well as an infinite complex of processes. Whitehead was clearly influenced by the early phases of quantum theory. Obviously, one would expect that there have to be similarities between quantum theory and process philosophy. In particular, the properties of an actual occasion and a quantum event are quite similar. It appears that the collapse of the quantum state is the atemporal process that corresponds to an actual entity, and the elementary quantum event corresponds to what Whitehead called the satisfaction of an actual entity. Another parallel one finds in the conception of a trajectory. It is a consequence of Heisenberg's uncertainty relations that a quantum particle cannot have a definite position in space and a definite momentum at the same time. Consequently, quantum particles cannot possess continuous trajectories because this would obviously force them to possess a definite position and a definite momentum at each time of their existence. The experimental result one gets from a bubble chamber experiment looks like the spatiotemporal continuous trajectory of a classical particle. But under closer inspection, it turns out that this continuous trajectory is merely a succession of discrete, that is, spatiotemporal non-overlapping events. This description of a trajectory is in accordance with Whitehead's concept of a society. But how far can Whitehead's metaphysics provide an ontological basis for quantum theory? Lately, some articles and books have been published on this subject. They are strong endorsement of process philosophy and striking parallels to Whitehead's formulations. The Copenhagen quantum theory was formulated as a practical set of rules for making predictions about what we human observers would observe under certain well-defined conditions. This pragmatic view is essentially subjective and epistemological, because the basic reality of the theory is our knowledge. It contains in itself no definite criterion of completeness. However, it is guided by two basic principles. The final theory should be comprehensive and unified. In this regard, the Copenhagen formulation includes an awkward feature. Human observers are excluded from the system. The theory is based on a bifurcation of the physical world into observer and observed. This situation is dissatisfying for someone who seeks a rationally and dynamically coherent understanding of what is actually going on. Because measuring devices and human bodies are made up of atoms, one expects that the laws of quantum theory, if universal, ought to work for these physical systems too. Two choices entered into the determination of what happens in quantum theory. One, the questions which are posed on nature, and two, the answer of nature to that particular question. That is, yes and no questions. Quantum theory gives a statistical prediction for the last answer, but the first one is decided by the experimenter. The exclusion of the experimenter from the system being investigated is fixed by the orthodox quantum theory, devised by von Neumann and Wigner. Von Neumann showed that the observed event in the external world is directly linked to the brain of the observer of that event. Very important. The observed system, process 2, is described in terms of quantum mathematics. The observing system, process 1, in terms of human experiences. Due to the fact that it makes no practical difference which of the various placements of the dividing line between the two systems one uses. Von Neumann puts all parts of nature composed of atomic constituents on the side described in terms of quantum mathematics, and only the consciousness of the observer outside of the mathematically described world. In von Neumann's formulation, the whole world is treated as a quantum system. He brought the physical and mental aspects of nature together as two aspects of a rationally coherent whole. Because his theory is built on Newtonian concept of an instant of time, it was elevated by Tomonaga and Schwinger to form a compatible with the physical requirements of the theory of relativity. They constructed a relativistic quantum field theory. The Tomonaga-Schwinger surface sigma does not differ significantly from the constant time surfaces of Newtonian physics. Contrary to the theory of relativity, there is a preferred sequence of instantaneous nows. Direct changes of a part of the surface sigma causes indirect changes along the rest of the surface due to quantum entanglements. These indirect changes produce the faster than light effects. Thus, quantum theory reverts at a certain deep ontological level to the Newtonian idea of instantaneous action at a distance, while maintaining all of the empirical demands of the theory of relativity. Nonetheless, there must be a dynamic connection between mind and brain. The mind of the observer is obviously connected to what is going on in his brain, and his choice of which questions to put to nature influences his brain in ways controlled in principle by quantum laws. Asking a question about something is closely connected to focusing one's attention on it. This connection can be found via the quantum Zeno effect. Very interesting. Take that up. Look it up. Which shows that how the choice and timing of questions can influence the course of events in the probe system. Physical principles do not specify which questions are posed to nature. This opens the logical possibility that our conscious thoughts could be entering into the mind-brain dynamics in a way reducible neither to purely mechanical effects governed by the Schrödinger equation of motion, nor to the random effects of nature's choice of outcomes. In general, our thoughts issue commands to attend to certain questions in the future. These directives supply the missing component of the quantum dynamics. They pose the particular questions that are put up in nature. The point is that the occurrence of conscious thought associated with the quantum system is supposed to cause a reduction of the state of that system to the reduced state. Since the question to be posed is supposed to be an experience, it would appear that it really ought to be part of the mental rather than the physical side of the mind-brain dynamics. Quantum theory has a lacuna that can very naturally be filled in such a way as to allow our thoughts to exercise real, though not absolute, control over the mechanical aspects of mind-brain dynamics. Well, this is important to establish actual events, and this is what he calls causal efficacy, but also the direct perception, the immediacy of reality, which is a completely different thing. They are in connection, but they are not in causal connection. Hereby he solves a problem that is of course solved in quantum mechanics, but nowhere else. And if you don't have this prospect, this understanding, you have only two choices. Either, as I mentioned before, number one, is an absolute physical reductionism. It doesn't matter if paradoxes arises, you simply don't have any choice whatsoever. The second is to acquire to some idealism, but that would be a lie. This is deceiving yourself, which is very common today. In order for us to enjoy spirituality or a God or an eternal soul, we lie to each other. This is a proven fact from functional magnetic resonance inference cameras and also EEGs and MEGs. We know this as a fact. It is very easily shown in the fractality of the brain waves. There can be no doubt, and there is only, I would say, a matter of time when lie detectors will be abandoned in the United States and replaced with an fMRI. And what will happen then? Well, it will be the end of lying, because there is no reason to lie anymore. Whitehead shows the path how to have both, and both is a necessity. Either you have to reduce everything to causal efficacy, and if you do that, not even that will work, but you don't have a choice. So we are choiceless. And I would say this goes for most quantum mechanics. Quantum physicists today are not aware of the Whiteheadian solution. Andrew Stepp, Carlo Rovelli, and of course Chris Fields are exceptions, but they belong to a minority. The Whiteheadian understanding is an absolute necessity. Otherwise, your philosophy will just be philosophizes. That is a disease of the mind, having no actual effects in the real world. And the real world is most definitely both mental and material at the very same time. And this goes to show the immediacy and the indirect causal efficacy builds up the universe and our own experience. I would say this also shows that we've been ignoring the subject in the West for so many millennia. We don't have any words anymore for different concepts in the mind, and horrendously we feel that to be unnecessary, to know the mental state. Whitehead is pointing to something that is completely the opposite. Without knowing the mental states, there can be no chance whatsoever to know anything about any physical, material states. Both are lost. So sticking for ordinary human beings in the Western Hemisphere before Whitehead, sticking to the causal efficacy is a necessity, but it doesn't mean that they reach reality. No, just the opposite. The mental side is important, the subjective side is important. And I think this could be the first step, putting the foot down and develop words, concept, investigating the subjective sphere, because it is concrescent, is concomitant, it comes together with the objective world, no matter what you put the boundaries. And without understanding subjective side, you can have no access to reality whatsoever. And here Harjuvadi comes in. He shows that all successful people higher up in enterprises, they all have the quantum conception. Otherwise, there will be beneath. There will be cogs in the machinery who believes that the machinery is all what reality is. There is no creativity there at all. It's absolute determinism. And that goes for 99% of the population in the Western Hemisphere. Whitehead shows that creativity is an important part of reality. Causal efficacy is not the only thing, but it is an important part and not to be ignored. Otherwise, you will just end up in the Russellian solipsism or idealism, and you will dream away your world, and you will have no possibility of not even understanding yourself. Because it's obvious, you have two poles. If you don't know the subjective pole, how on earth could you know the objective pole? Quantum mechanics shows that is impossible. Alice and Bob's example shows the impossibility of that as well. Only the subjective relational observer can have the knowledge. Ignoring the position of the subject, the state of the subject, the modus, the Stimmung, will handicap all of reality. You will have no access to knowledge, space, or time. And he also goes to a venomous attack against the incredible, horrendous fallacy of the idea of a point like now. The now always has its extension in temporality, is always extended. Also clearly shown by classical quantum mechanics, the orthodox model. It is not a fact in Newtonian classical physics, where time is point-like. It doesn't even have a potential extension. It's absolutely point-like. Whitehead and quantum mechanics in the orthodox form shows if that is the case, you have no access to extension, neither temporality. You have none. Only having causal efficacy, it is like holding a piece of paper with a map in front of your face, almost like the way I'm reading the paper, and ignoring reality, because you have no other choice. And the realization of Whitehead could not have come without quantum mechanics. Very important to understand that. And everyone who hasn't come in contact with Whitehead will have the only other model. They will only have causal efficacy. There is no other choice. This is the genius of Alfred North Whitehead. And now I also understand why I didn't encounter Alfred North Whitehead in philosophy. As the professor said, it defies understanding. Yes, it's a tough nut to crack, but we spend almost 1,200 episodes to prepare for this understanding. It's a work. And of course, if you have the old classical Newtonian model with a point-like time, there is no extension, and therefore there can be no work, because your life is just now. Why would you invest anything for the future in this very now? No, you wouldn't. You are stuck in the now. You are, so to speak, future and past blind. This stuckedness is a very typical feature of modern man. It is just now. We cannot care about the future because we can't understand it. Only causal efficacy doesn't give that liberty of thinking into the future. It stops it. And trying to enforce future from the outside will just worsen the scenario, most definitely. Whitehead is a relief. It's an eye-opener. Still, some aspects are still not understood, but it shows that a double solution can be explained in other terms, like the double split example. He shows in a philosophy the double split is the immediacy of perception and the causal efficacy. And of course, perception is the new thing. In a way, well, it changes causal efficacy as well. Both become much more important than they are in the regular everyday experience, when none of this matters, because we today ignore both the subjective and the objective side, and we live not in between but nowhere, and therefore we just Plato, we suffer, and as he felt himself, life became more and more unbearable for every minute, hour, day, month and year of his life. He became more and more shut off. The destiny of all philosophers up to quantum mechanics, for a very good reason. it only opens up here. The road taken by earlier thinkers led us to the absolute determined factor only to strive to the causal efficacy. There is no other choice. Once you strut for that path, firstly trod upon the Ionian philosophers of nature. Those were the first one, and that discovery was an important one, but it needed to be sided with the immediacy of perception, something that I think Heraclitus also tried to do. So Whitehead could be called a modern day Heraclitean philosopher or Heraclitean disciple. But it's easier to understand Whitehead because what he uses is more close to quantum physics. You can see the double slit experiment is exactly the same as the immediacy of perception and the efficacy of causation. The causal efficacy are both present in the double slit experiment. The wind is brisking on. We are now having an afternoon, and I wish you a very pleasant day. Thank you very much for your patience, and I hope the wind wasn't bothering too much. Next time I hope I'll fix the problem with the microphone. Bye bye for now.